Welcome to Pragim Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 40 of ASP.NET video series. In part 36 of this video series, we have discussed the basics of working with the wizard control. In this session, we'll look at the more advanced features of the wizard control, like setting focus to the first control in the wizard step when the page loads, attaching JavaScript to the next, previous, and finish buttons to display a confirmation dialog box before the user moves to the next step, setting useSubmit behavior is equal to true for the previous button in the wizard control so that when the user hits the enter button after entering data, the user moves to the next step in the wizard rather than to the previous step. Before continuing with the session, I strongly recommend to watch parts 37, 38, and 39 of this video series. Let's flip to Visual Studio. Here I have a very simple ASP.NET web application project. Let's add the wizard control to this web form. Alright, by default the wizard will have two wizard steps. Let's copy and paste this wizard step so that we get the third one. Let's get rid of this ID for the wizard step, and I'm going to call this step 3. Okay, now let's put some controls in this wizard control so that we have something to work with. So let's drag and drop a text box control. And if you look at this one, this text box is within the first wizard step. So let's call this step 1 text box. And along the same lines, let's copy and paste that in each step. And let's call this text box maybe step 2 text box, because this is present inside step 2, and similarly this one step 3 text box. Okay, the first thing that we'll notice is setting focus to the first control in the wizard step. Now if you look at this one, this is a very simple wizard control with 3 wizard steps within that, and each step has a text box inside it. So obviously if we flip to the design mode, you can see the text box in each step of the wizard control. Now look at this, when I run this project, as soon as the page loads, look at what happens. The user has to move the cursor into the text box to start typing. By default the cursor is not within the text box. Look at that. So I have to move my cursor, click in the text box, and then start typing. Now just to improve the user experience a little, wouldn't it be nice when the page loads, if the cursor is already in that text box so that the user can straight away start typing. So how do we do that? Obviously to do that, we call the focus method on the text box. So all we have to do is, if you look at this text box ID, that's step 1 text box. So what we basically can do in the code behind file on the page load, we can say step 1 text box dot focus. We do that on the page load. So now when we run the web application project, as soon as the page loads, notice that the cursor will be ready in the text box. Look at that, I didn't click in the text box. As soon as the page loaded, you can see the cursor blinking in the text box, and I can start typing in it straight away. But then when I click the next button, look at what's going to happen. Now we are on step 2 of the wizard control, but then now look at this. For this text box, the cursor is not blinking there. Okay, which means we have to do that for text box 2 as well. So based on the step I am in of this wizard control, I have to set the focus to that text box control. Now if you remember in the previous sessions of this video series, we know that this wizard control, as we change the steps that we want to navigate to, there is a property called active step index. Okay, so which is a 0 index based collection. So step 1 is actually active step index is 0. For step 2 it is 1, and for step 3 it is 2. So based on that, we will have to decide which text box we want to have the focus received. And to do that, so what we basically can do is, if wizard1 dot active step index, if the active step index is 0, then we know that we are on the first step of the wizard control, in which case we want the step 1 text box to receive the focus. Else if the active step index is 1, then we know that we are on step 2 of the wizard control, in which case we want step 2 text box to receive the focus. Okay. And else if the active step index is 2, then we know that we are on step 3 of the wizard control, in which case we want step 3 text box to receive the focus. Okay, now let's run this and see what happens. So I run the page, and then when I am in step 1, look at that, the cursor is already blinking there. Now I click the next button, I go to step 2, but look at that, the cursor is not blinking there. Let's examine why that's the case, because if you remember, the way we have coded it, okay, if it active step index is 0, then set the focus to text box 1. If it is 1, which means we are on step 2 of the wizard control, then set the focus to step 2. So why isn't it working as expected? Let's put a breakpoint here and run the application and see why that text box is not receiving the focus when we navigate to step 2 of the wizard control. So when the page loads, look at that, active step index is 0. So now let me press F10. So it comes inside the if block and sets the focus for text box 1, which is good, and the cursor is blinking within the text box. Now let's click the next button. As we do that, okay, it again comes into the page load event. Now look at the active step index. It is still 0, because remember, the active step index gets changed on the button click event, and page load event happens before the button click event. That's why the active step index is still 0. Now let's press F5. Now let me click on step 3, and now look at the active step index. It is 1, which is the previous active step index. So because this page load fires before the button click event, it still remembers the previous active step index, because on the button click event it's going to change it to 3. Okay, that's why page load is not the correct event to have this code. You should have this code in an event which happens after the button click event. So which event happens after the button click event? Page pre-render. So all we have to do is, let's stop debugging here. Instead of having this code in the page load event, I will copy and paste that in the page pre-render event of this web form. So the event name is pre-render, and then I will move this piece of code into that event handler. So now if we run this, the wizard control should work as expected. On each step, the respective, look at that, we are on step 1, text box has the focus, I click next, on step 2 the text box has the focus. Similarly on step 3 the text box has the focus. Okay, so we are making the active step index, we are using that property to set the focus to the correct text box control. Alright, the next thing that we'll look at is attaching JavaScript to the next, previous and finish buttons, so that when the user clicks them, they can get some kind of a confirmation. Let's say now if we run this application now, when I click the next button, I directly move to the next step of the wizard. Instead of that, let's say when I click that button, I want to show a dialog box, are you sure, do you want to move to the next step? And then when the customer clicks okay, only then it should move to the next step. When he clicks cancel, he should stay on the same step of the wizard control. Is it possible to do? Absolutely, but then we have to slightly modify the wizard control. Now if you look at this wizard control, this next button, is there a declaration for this next button in the HTML anywhere on the web form? No, all we have on this web form is a wizard control. We don't have the declaration for this button control. So where is this button control coming from? This button control is automatically generated by the wizard control based on the step type. Now the step, the first step is the start step type, so it only shows the next button. Whereas if you look at the next step, this is a step, the step type of this step is a step, because this is not a finish step, this is not a start step, so this is an intermediate step, in which case the wizard control will display next and previous buttons. On the other hand, the third step is the final step, okay, in which case it will display finish and previous buttons. Now the wizard control is able to determine what buttons to show based on the step type of that wizard step, and these buttons are automatically generated. So we have a limited control on those buttons. Now if I want to attach a custom JavaScript to these button controls, it's not easy to do with the automatically generated buttons. So what we have to do in that case is to use some templates for the wizard control. Okay, now the easiest way to do that is flip this web form into the design mode, and then this button that you see here, this is called as show smart tag button. When you click this, you have some templates here. There is something called convert to start navigation template. Now look at the wizard control. Before we do that, all we have within this wizard control are some wizard steps. Okay, so I'm going to go to the design and click on this show smart tag button, or what you can do is right click and say show smart tags. Okay, here look at that, I'm going to convert to start navigation template. Okay, after I have done that, flip to the source mode. Look at what happened to the HTML that's generated. Now the wizard steps, they are as usual, but then there is a new piece of HTML here, start navigation template. And if you look at the start navigation template, it has got one button control within that. And if you look at the text of the button control, it says next. So we have, this is the button control which is getting displayed on the wizard control. Okay, and if you look at the command name, it's like move next, move to the next step. Okay, now to attach JavaScript, all you have to do is, now JavaScript is a little client-side script that runs when the button gets clicked on the client side. So there is an event for this button called on client click. So on client click, I want to attach some JavaScript to this button control. So what I want to do is return, there is a confirm JavaScript function, confirm, are you sure you want to go to next step? Okay, so this is the JavaScript that we want to have this button execute when on the client side. So we are attaching this JavaScript to this on client click event, and if you look at this function, it's a built-in JavaScript function that displays a dialog box with OK and cancel. When the user clicks on OK, that returns true. When that returns true, the page will be posted back to the server. If the user clicks on cancel button, that returns false, in which case the page will not be posted back to the server. Okay, so now let's run this. And then when the page loads, and then when I click on the next button, look at that. Let's call this first step. So I entered some text, first step, into the text box, and then look at this. When I click the button, are you sure you want to go to the next step? Okay, I get this little confirmation. If I click cancel, I stay on the same page. On the other hand, if I click OK, I will move to the next step. Okay, now we have seen how to attach the JavaScript using the HTML, using the on client click attribute of the button control. Now, is it possible to attach this JavaScript using code? Absolutely. Let's see how to do that. Now look at that. When I run this, we only have, if you look at the template that is generated, it's a start navigation template, which is the template for showing this button for step 1, whose step type is start. Now when I go to the next step, here I have a previous and next buttons. Now if I click next here, look at that, I am not getting that confirmation. That's because this next button is present in a different template. Okay, so if I go to the wizard control now, go to the design mode. Now if on the source, if you notice, we only have start navigation template. If I go to the wizard control, there is another template, step navigation template. For all the steps before the start and finish steps, between these two steps, the first and last step, all these steps, use the step navigation template. Okay, so convert to step navigation template, and as you might expect, the step navigation template will have two buttons within that, to go to the previous step and to go to the next step. Okay, so text is previous, for this one it is next, and obviously command name here is move next, and for this button it's move previous. Okay, now let's see how to attach the JavaScript to this step next button in the code behind file. Now obviously, to do that using code, we will have to identify this button control and then attach the JavaScript to that button control. Now identifying this button control is a little trickier here, because look at this. If I want to access the text box, all I am doing here in the web form is step 1 text box dot. I'm able to access the text box, but how do I access this button control? Can I directly say step next button dot? I cannot do that. In fact, the web form says, okay, this is not identified. Okay, that's because this is not present, directly within the web form. It's present inside a template. So we have to use a find control method to find the controls inside a template. And if you look at this template, where is this template present? That's present inside the wizard control. And what's the ID of the wizard? It's wizard1. Now let me actually run this one, and we will find out the hierarchy of the controls within which we have that button control. So if I click next, for example, here to go to step 2, and then I right click on the page and say view source, when I look at the page source, notice that for the next button, here is the next button, step next button, that's the ID, which is present in another control called step navigation template container ID, which is present inside wizard1 control. So that's the hierarchy. So let's copy that. I'm going to close that. Okay, so that's where we have, so that's the path where we have the step next button. So inside wizard1 and step navigation template container ID, and within that we have the step next button. So to get to that, I can say wizard1 dot find control. Within wizard1, I want to find the step navigation template container ID. So copy that. And if you look at this find control method, it expects the ID of the control that we want to find. So let's pass that. And then within that, we want to find control. And what is the control's ID? Step next button. So if you remember, if we flip to the HTML, the ID of this button is step next button. So find that there. Now we know that this is going to return a button control. So what we have to do is button, let's call it btn, is equal to that. And we know that this returns a button, but if you look at the return type of the find control method, it returns control. But we know that we are expecting a button control there, so we need to typecast that to be of type button. And all we do here is button.onClientClick is equal to, we attach the same JavaScript that we want to execute. Instead of typing that, let's copy it from here. Okay, so now if we run, even on the second step, when I click the next button, we should get that confirmation, are you sure you want to go to the next step? So on the first step, I click next, I get the confirmation, I click OK, I go to the next step, this is on step 2, I click the next button, I get the confirmation as expected. Similarly, if you want the confirmation for the finish button, all you do, you can either do it on in the code behind file, or you can do the in the HTML. Okay, so if you want to do it for the finish button, you convert to finish navigation template. Okay. The final thing, we'll see how to set use submit behavior is equal to true, and this is really useful. This can improve your user experience. So right now as it stands, let's go to step 1. Look at that. Let's say I type in step 1, and then I'm hitting enter key. I'm not using my mouse. All I have done is typed something into the text box, and I'm clicking on the next button. Currently I am on step 1. When I hit the enter key, look at that. Are you sure you want to go to the next step? Okay. And I come to the next step, and step 2, we are currently on step 2, and I'm not using my mouse. I'm hitting the enter key. Look at that. It goes to the previous step, but I actually wanted to go to the next step. That's because, look at this, when I click next, we come to the screen. On this screen, the previous button is before the next button. And by default, if you remember, in part 39 of this series, we have discussed about use submit behavior property. This property will be true for all the button controls, meaning which they use the built-in browser submit functionality. And here, the previous button is acting as, when I press the enter key, the event handler of that button is getting executed. We want to disable that. And how do we do that? By setting use submit behavior property of that button control to false. And the significance of use submit behavior property, we have discussed about that in part 39 of this video series. I would strongly encourage you to watch that video first before continuing with this session if you haven't already done so. So to correct this problem, all I have to do is, in the source, in the step navigation template, this is the previous button. So all I want to do here is use submit behavior is equal to false. So this is not going to use the built-in browser's submit behavior. Okay, so now if we run this, I am on step 1. I hit enter. I'm not using my mouse. I hit enter. I go to the next screen, and I say step 2. And similarly, I hit enter. Look at that. Are you sure you want to go to the next step? And I come to the step 3. On this slide, you can find resources for ASP.NET C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.